Imagine a heavy commercial semi-truck slamming on its brakes on a crowded highway. Now, imagine the driver behind the wheel is a seasoned professional with 1,000,000 miles under his belt. We expect him to handle that rig differently than a teenager who just got her license. If that truck rear-ends someone, how does a court figure out who is legally at fault? Today, we are going to build a definitive framework for determining tort liability, specifically looking at how the law measures people with specialized training or superior skills. This document shows the anatomy of a negligence claim and the 5 elements a plaintiff must prove: duty, standard of care, breach of duty, cause in fact, proximate cause, and damages. We will zoom in on the first 2 steps, establishing a duty and proving a breach. Establishing a duty and proving that the defendant breached it is the critical threshold of any negligence case. If you cannot prove a breach of duty occurred, the rest of the elements simply do not matter. So, how do we measure a breach? We compare the defendant's actions against this figure, the reasonable, prudent person. This is a hypothetical avatar representing the standard of care expected by the community. This measurement is strictly objective. We look at the defendant's outward conduct and compare it to our hypothetical community member, rather than taking a subjective look into the defendant's mind. This means a defendant's good intentions, their general clumsiness, or even their personal best efforts are legally irrelevant. Doing your personal best is not enough if your best falls below the community standard. Likewise, you cannot claim ignorance of obvious hazards. If a driver causes a wreck while driving on dangerously bald tires, they cannot avoid liability by claiming they didn't know the tires were risky. A reasonable person is expected to know that. Society relies on this objective baseline for a very practical reason. If courts accepted subjective, personal excuses for every mistake, proving negligence would be almost impossible. That would force innocent victims to shoulder the financial burden of someone else's carelessness. While the standard is objective, it isn't completely rigid. The law allows the reasonable prudent person standard to flex, accommodating specific verifiable circumstances the defendant is facing. Look at this image of someone navigating with a white cane. When a defendant has a distinct physical impairment, like blindness, the standard is modified. The question becomes, what would a reasonably prudent blind person do in that exact situation? The standard also adjusts for sudden crises, known as the sudden emergency doctrine. If a driver is abruptly faced with an unexpected hazard, their conduct is measured against what a reasonable person would do in that split-second emergency. However, there is a strict exception. You cannot claim a sudden emergency if your own negligence created the crisis in the first place. If you are tailgating the car in front of you and they slam on their brakes, you placed yourself in peril. It is also important to note that while physical conditions modify the standard, mental disabilities generally do not. Adult defendants with mental impairments are still held to the exact same objective standard of care as anyone else. The legal system accommodates undeniable physical realities and unavoidable crises, but even within those constraints, it still strictly evaluates whether the resulting conduct was reasonable for someone in those precise shoes. This brings us back to the problem of specialized skills. Look at this professional truck driver. How do we evaluate someone who possesses extensive training that the average person simply doesn't have? Under the superior knowledge rule and the profession or trade principle, the court considers those specific skills as part of the circumstances surrounding the event. Here is where many people make a critical error. They claim that professionals are held to a higher standard of care. You must avoid using that phrasing on an exam. The standard of care actually remains exactly the same. It is still just ordinary care. But the definition of what constitutes ordinary care expands to fit the individual. As we see in this split-screen comparison, ordinary care for someone with a commercial license inherently includes utilizing all the specialized training, perception, and memory required to obtain that license in the first place. Possessing superior skills redefines the baseline of your everyday responsibilities. If you have special knowledge that could prevent an accident, failing to use it is an act of negligence. Now that we have the rules, let's look at a practical way to drafting your legal conclusions. We call it the because formula. This text template maps the specific defendant to the objective standard, followed immediately by the fact-based justification for that pairing. Applying this to our professional driver, we get the truck driver is held to the standard of an ordinary person with commercial driving experience because a reasonable person utilizes all relevant special knowledge they possess to mitigate risks. Notice how this drafted paragraph successfully identifies the objective standard and correctly accounts for the driver's superior skill, while safely avoiding the trap of claiming a higher standard of care. Now it's your turn. Look at this photo of a young child operating a powerful snowmobile. For your next exercise, apply the because formula to determine the correct standard of care for a minor engaging in an inherently dangerous adult activity.